When we think about the Middle Ages, we picture gloomy castles, grumpy monks, and a world where fun simply didn't exist. But here's the shocking twist. Medieval people were way more obsessed with sex than you'd ever imagine. From public bathhouses to streets literally named after prostitution, the Middle Ages weren't prudish at all. Stick around, because we're about to dive into scandals, forbidden romances, and even fart jokes that medieval lords thought were hilarious. Ready to have your mind blown about how naughty the Middle Ages really were? We often imagine the Middle Ages as dark and puritanical, but that's mostly thanks to the Catholic Church. The Church left behind most of the written sources we have today, and of course, they weren't going to write cheerful stories about people having fun in bed. Instead, they warned against pleasure at every turn. Wars, famine, and plagues didn't help that grim picture either. But here's the thing. Behind all the preaching, medieval people lived normal, messy, and surprisingly passionate lives, far from the boring image we've been taught. Step into a medieval city like York or London, and you'd quickly realize sex was everywhere. Some streets had names so blunt they'd shock us today. Places called Grope Cunt Lane or Horse Mount weren't jokes. They literally told you what kind of business went on there. Just like Milk Street sold dairy, these lanes offered something else entirely. Imagine walking through town and seeing a street sign that flat out told you where to find prostitutes. For medieval people, this wasn't hidden away. It was just another part of daily life. Prostitution wasn't just tolerated, it was often regulated by city laws. Authorities tried to control where brothels could operate, usually zoning them to specific districts. To make sure sex workers were easily recognized, many cities forced them to wear special clothing like striped hoods, bright colors, or even bells that jingled as they walked. Can you imagine? It was humiliating, but at the same time, these women often turned restrictions into fashion, setting trends that even high-class ladies copied. Once again, sex work wasn't hiding in the shadows, it was in plain sight. Why would a woman choose this life? In a patriarchal world with few options, sex work could mean independence and serious money. For poor girls arriving from the countryside, it was sometimes the only way to survive in the big city. Unlike farm, labor, or servitude, sex work could pay far more in less time. Of course, it wasn't without stigma or danger, but it gave some women a chance at freedom, wealth, or even influence. Ironically, in a world ruled by men, some of the boldest women made their mark through this path. Forget the myth that medieval people never bathed. In reality, they cared a lot about smelling fresh. Public bathhouses were common, and many were mixed men and women bathing together. No wonder they doubled as places for flirting and sex. Some women who worked in laundries or bathhouses even picked up clients there, which is why lavender girls became slang for sex workers. These steamy places weren't just about hygiene, they were hotspots of social and erotic life, proving medieval people were far from prudish. Love and flirting weren't limited to bathhouses. The courts of Europe had their own rules of passion, known as courtly love. Noblemen wrote poetry, played songs, and used elaborate compliments to woo married ladies. Some pickup lines from the 1200s would make you laugh today. Things like, "The arrow of your love wounds me deeply." It was a refined game of seduction, but make no mistake, it wasn't always innocent. Behind the pretty words were real affairs, dangerous to reputations but impossible to resist. The Catholic Church, however, was not amused. Officially, sex was only allowed between a married man and woman, only in the missionary position, and only for the purpose of making children. No undressing completely, no kissing too passionately, and definitely no fun. To make things worse, some days of the week were off limits, like Sundays and feast days. Basically, the Church's rules made sex sound like the most boring chore in the world. But here's the twist. Almost nobody actually followed these rules. Even priests themselves didn't always practice what they preached. In Prague, one priest kept a brothel in his own home. Another openly lived with a mistress, and yet another was caught running naked through the streets after being discovered in a brothel. Imagine sitting in church, hearing a fiery sermon about sin, from the same man you saw last night streaking past your house. These stories show how medieval hypocrisy was alive and well, The church shouted no, but its own members were often first in line to break the rules. For ordinary people, privacy was nearly impossible. Families often shared a single room and one bed. Servants slept alongside each other in dormitories. So if you wanted intimacy, chances were someone else could hear or even see what was happening. Couples improvised, sneaking into dark corners, barns, or even alleyways. Growing up, many children probably overheard their parents having sex, simply because there was no way around it. To modern eyes it seems shocking, but for medieval people, it was just everyday life. One of the strangest medieval records comes from York. A man named John was accused of impotence, and the church had to test him. How? By sending wise matrons to try and arouse him. These women even exposed their breasts, but poor John failed miserably. The verdict: utterly useless. Imagine the humiliation, your private life, judged by strangers, then written down for history to laugh at. 800 years later, we still remember him, all because of one very awkward test. Not all stories were about shame. In 14th century London, a sex worker named Eleanor Rykener was arrested for breaking zoning laws. But here's the twist. She had been born as John Rykener and lived openly as a woman. Eleanor worked in London and Oxford, and her court case shows that queer lives existed long before modern times. The court didn't care about her gender identity, only that she was caught in the wrong place. Eleanor's story reminds us that medieval sexuality was far more complex than people think. Life for the wealthy looked very different. In royal castles, 4-poster beds with curtains offered rare privacy. King Edward I even had one of the finest beds built in the Tower of London. But don't be fooled, royal bedchambers were often full of courtiers and servants passing through. Privacy was a luxury, and even kings had to pull the curtains tight to hide from prying eyes. Beds were not just for sleeping or sex. They were political stages of dynasty and power. Royal weddings came with a bizarre ritual called the bedding ceremony. After the priest blessed the bed, there was wine, laughter, and even a game of throwing stockings. If your stocking hit the king or queen, you were destined to marry next. Finally, the newlyweds were tucked in by groomsmen and bridesmaids, while everyone watched. Only after the curtains closed were they expected to consummate the marriage. It wasn't romantic, it was politics. The entire dynasty depended on what happened in that bed. For nobles, sex was duty, heirs had to be born. Passion often lived outside marriage. Courtly love gave people an excuse to seek romance elsewhere. Secret meetings, poetry, songs, and stolen kisses filled their lives with excitement that official marriages lacked. It was a dangerous game. Affairs could destroy reputations and even kingdoms. But for many nobles, the thrill of forbidden love was worth the risk. Just like today, rules couldn't stop desire, they only made it burn hotter. Courtly love wasn't just about pretty words. It often led to secret affairs that avoided pregnancy. Non-procreative, sex, oral, manual. Anything that couldn't produce an heir was surprisingly common among nobles. Medieval writers even warned that real danger came when forbidden lovers had the wrong kind of sex, the kind that risked children. Think of Guinevere and Lancelot. In Arthurian legend, their affair didn't ruin Camelot until they crossed that line. Desire was fine, but heirs? That was dangerous business. At the other end of medieval love were jokes that would make even modern stand-up comedians blush. Geoffrey Chaucer's tales featured fart jokes, adultery schemes, and women tricking men in bed. Banquets echoed with bawdy songs and dirty puns, shared by peasants and nobles alike. Imagine sitting at a royal feast, sipping wine, while the punchline is literally someone kissing the wrong end of a lover. For medieval people, sex and laughter were inseparable. Comedy thrived on lust and scandal. So what was sex really like in the Middle Ages? Not reserved, not prudish, but bold, messy, and everywhere. From streets named after brothels to priests caught in scandals, from royal bedding ceremonies to fart jokes at banquets, medieval people were just as obsessed with desire as we are. The difference? They had less privacy and more rules, but they still found ways to break them. Their world reminds us that human passion hasn't changed much in 1,000 years.